All right, this is Jeff Nyquist and another edition of Friends and Enemies. And we covered World War I last week. We're going to cover the first half of World War II this week because it's so much to cover. We're going to cover two sides. We're going to cover the espionage of it. My pet peeve about World War II history is that many Western historians in their histories just accept Soviet historical accounts of World War II, of the battles on the Eastern Front, where the Soviets actually leave big things out, battles that the Soviets lost. They exaggerate, battles. They create battles that really weren't big battles, like the Battle of Moscow in late '41 was not the big battle the Soviets claimed it was. So it's a curious history because, of course, people want to falsify history. A lot of people say the victors write the history. Well, that's not even true. That's another one of my pet peeves because you go back to the Peloponnesian War. Actually, Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, was not a Spartan, he was an Athenian. So the victor didn't write the history. The vanquished wrote the history. And he wrote it fairly objectively. But so it's not always true that the victors, sometimes it is. And in the case of World War II, of course, this is really the case with the Russians. So we have to be very careful in trying to understand the war because the Russians are covering up the fact that they started the war as Hitler's partners and that they fell out. And that's a big part of this story. The way this partnership ended up causing the war, really. So maybe, Alex, you want to start talking about the different powers that existed at the time and how it was sort of a three-way struggle.
Exactly. So, well, what annoys me about his history, the books that have been written about the war, mainly it's for me, it's avoiding the intelligence sphere. So we got some information about the British SOE, the Special Operations Executive, and this has been turned into even television documentaries and movies and all that. So when you had these commandos that were half soldiers, half spies, and they were parachuted into occupied France, and they linked up with the French resistance and so on and so forth, that's an interesting chapter when it comes to intelligence, but it's just a fraction of the overall picture. And the other thing that we got, I think, decades later, was Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking unit that made this big machine so they could decrypt the Nazi communications that were encrypted with these handy-dandy little Enigma machines. But there's there's also another layer to this. There's also another layer to this Enigma thing
Yeah,
that I found.
should add that when people celebrate this, and it was sort of kept secret even a little bit after the war, the Enigma was the German cipher machine code system. The Germans also broke the Allied code. And not only that, the Germans were able to tap into the transatlantic telephone cable line. And they actually were able to listen in to some of the phone conversations between Churchill and Roosevelt. And this, of course, is related, I think, by Walter Schellenberg, talks about some of that. So at different times, the Germans could read the British, and the British could read the Germans. And then, like you say, they made movies out of celebrating a lot of the Allied intelligence triumphs. And of course, the Germans didn't have a lot of intelligence triumphs because the head of the Abwehr, Admiral Canaris, was really very sympathetic to the Allies, and he didn't like Hitler. And he tried to undermine Hitler. But at the same time, he was against the communists, and he didn't want the Soviet Union to win the war. So, and this is where Kim Philby, the British actually suspected Philby might not be right, but they gave him access to intelligence. They actually gave him access to their suspicions that Canaris might be helping them. Canaris didn't openly come to the British and say, "I'm helping you," that we know of, although there might have been a secret meeting between him and C in Spain. I think, in 1941 maybe? I've got the book right here, and I read two books on Canaris last year. But Canaris, as far as we know, he actually stopped Sea Lion. He convinced the German Navy and Army that there were twice as many active British divisions ready to oppose an invasion than there were. And that if they had known the real numbers, and Canaris had given them the right numbers in Norway, in Poland, in France, and so they trusted him because his information had been very good up until then. He falsified the data
Interesting.
on Sea Lion.
Yeah.
And, Hitler, a lot of the German generals like Keitel said, oh, it was disaster. Sea Lion would have never worked. And of course, Admiral Rader in his biography said, this wasn't going to work. But actually, given if they had known there were half as many divisions in what actual state they were in, because the British Army left all of its equipment on the beach at Dunkirk, they might have gone ahead and done it. And that might have been good or bad for either side,
Yeah.
because we don't know what would have happened then.
Yeah, we also got some material on the backroom negotiations, the secret back channels, when German generals and others, and of course as you mentioned, these intelligence people like Canaris, Oster, and all the others, they tried to negotiate with the British behind Hitler's back. Then he found out about it. Then he kind of let it continue for a while. There were also secret negotiations with the Americans, and so this is sort of what we got, or what historians have been focusing on. But I think that the overall picture here is what really is really the most important, and that's the intelligence penetration of Germany, of Britain, and the United States. So because if we look at the 1920s and the 1930s, the time before the war, there were some outrageous intelligence disasters in the West, and so this is sort of where the communists were able to shine, in the intelligence front. And so we're gonna look at these different countries before the war, where they were at, what their intentions were, and also what the penetration was and how that played out. So maybe let's start with the United States. Now, of course, the entry into World War I was absolutely key, and Germans had underestimated the Americans, and the Americans they sent over 2 million soldiers in a very short amount of time. The Americans had also produced tens of thousands of four-wheel drive trucks that were used by various countries in the war, and so then after World War I, America sort of went back to the position of not interfering and just focusing on domestic issues. Just like, some people today say, why should we care about Ukraine? Why should we get involved? Why should we get involved in Europe at all? Why shouldn't we let Russia do what it wants to do in Europe? This does not concern America. So this was sort of a discussion back then in the United States. Now, of course, America's economy was becoming so much stronger in the 1920s and 30s. The new inventions, the new improved engines that were later used in airplanes, the superchargers, and all that stuff that became important. So, what do you think about that? Some call it isolationism, that was going on in the 1920s and 30s in regards to America.
I should talk about American diplomatic history, and it really starts with George Washington. If you remember, we had the new Constitution, and George Washington became president in 1789, and you had the new Constitution come into effect, and you had the French Revolution, which started in 1789. And the French Revolution was a battle in which the French, who had been our allies in the American Revolution, had this revolution of their own, which initially had some of the same ideas of liberty that the American Revolution had. And of course, the American Revolution was split between sort of, you could say, conservatives and more liberal, because really conservatives started out. I mean,
Yeah.
people say that Edmund Burke was the founder of Anglo-Saxon conservatism. He was a Rockingham Whig. The Whig Party was basically the liberal party of its day. They believed in, freedom. They believed in they had ideals of liberty and open commerce. They believed in capitalism. And he was a Rockingham Whig, and he had basically warned that the American Revolution, the Americans had a point, that Britain was double taxing the Americans, controlling their trade and taxing them, which was just crushing them. And he said, this is the best part of the British Empire. You don't want to lose this. Mm. But what happened is that, so the Americans had two sides, and you had the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. And the Anti-Federalists became the Democratic Republican Party, it was called at the time. We call it the Democratic Party now, a party of Jefferson. It ended up being. And to understand this division, George Washington, the big problem was half of America supported the French Revolution. The other half thought the French Revolution was different than the American Revolution. It was dangerous. The Jacobinism was dangerous, that it wasn't really freedom, and that had more sympathy with views like Burke's. And Washington and Adams and Alexander Hamilton were of that group. Jefferson was not. That's why Jefferson ended up leaving the Washington administration. So this problem, these wars, which became, the wars of revolution, the coalition wars against the French Republic, there were Americans who wanted to be on the side of France, and there were Americans, of course, who wanted to stay out, and that was the party of Washington. They said, we don't want to get involved in Europe's business. We've got this country over here, it's developing, it's new. We can't afford to be involved in Europe's quarrels. So when George Washington left office, and of course, you had, when Adams was president, you had the XYZ affair where America almost went to war with France during the Adams administration. So you had this real pull to pull America in. And of course, the British were, putting on this blockade where they were boarding American merchantmen and they were seizing the crews and actually pressing them into service in the British fleet. It's terrible things going on. And it was very difficult for all the American presidents, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, to keep America out of the wars in Europe during the Napoleon. Of course, we ended up in 1812 being in that war. We did ultimately get dragged in. But Washington said very clearly in his farewell address that America should have no foreign entanglements. We should not become involved. We need to grow and build. We have a whole continent we need to concentrate on. And this is John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, said similar things. He actually came up, he was Secretary of State under President Monroe. The Monroe Doctrine really was formulated by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who later had one term as president himself. And so this was, and of course, John Quincy Adams, I think, is the one that enunciated that we have sympathy for, freedom everywhere, but we are not going to, fight for it. It's not our obligation to fight wars for it. So this was deeply held in American foreign policy until the Spanish-American War. And if you read a history of the Spanish-American War, you will see that many Republicans and even Democrats who looked back at John Quincy Adams in Washington and said, look, we should have gone to war with Spain. We shouldn't be involved we actually conquered the Philippines and Cuba, right? And we kept the Philippines as a territory of the United States until, through World War II, when the Japanese were fighting us. We got in World War II because we owned the Philippines. We wouldn't have been in World War II. There would have been no reason for the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor if there hadn't been a Spanish-American War. And that we didn't know that because the Philippines sat astride the Japanese sea lane to the Indonesian oil and to the resources of French Indochina. So so this is how we got into our, and back in the day, Henry Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, the great grandson of John Adams, was a very famous. He was a Harvard professor, history professor. He wrote a history of the United States. He at the time was saying, this is a terrible thing to break with Washington, to break with our tradition of staying to our own hemisphere,
Hmm.
right? And so that's why we had the attitude. And World War One was actually a bitter experience because why did we fight it? And many Americans were disillusioned by the Versailles Treaty because although there was a lot of hatred of the Germans and Germans were persecuted during the war to some extent here domestically, there was some bad things. There were a lot of people who thought the Germans were treated unfairly, that the League of Nations was a pipe dream, that we would be dragged into further conflicts. And Americans didn't want it. They thought that the war was
Hmm.
wrong, that these Americans had suffered and died in World War One
Yeah, and
needlessly.
even by Adolf Hitler's own calculations, the total endgame battle would have happened in the 1980s. So this was from Hitler's second book that he ultimately didn't want published because he sort of gave away his overall strategy, the idea when to attack this country and then that country. So in short, Hitler wanted this alliance with the British, and he wanted to make Britain really Germanic, so to speak, and put a certain person on the throne in Britain. And so by having this empire, they wanted to take out, of course, France. They wanted to take out the Soviet Union, and ultimately in the 1980s, meaning 50 years into the future, that was the time when Hitler expected this great end battle where this German mega empire would then ultimately attack the United States. And of course, in the 1910s, in the 1920s, I don't think many people in America, even politicians, I don't think many people understood the rapid progression in technology, where you could estimate that at a certain point in the distant future, maybe an invasion of the United States was actually doable. I think people underestimated that, just like people underestimated now. I mean, who expects today? Who expects an invasion of the United States? People think America is perfectly safe, but as we mentioned
Well,
before, as we,
back in the
as we
late
mentioned
19th.
before in a show, just,
Yeah.
just to finish this point because I think it's important, really. We talked about this in a previous show when today or in the near future when Russia actually takes over Western Europe, that would boost Russia's power and make them powerful enough to actually attack the United States. And I don't think Americans in the 1910s, 1920s really understood that progression of technology.
Yeah, a lot of people don't understand that the SS under Heinrich Himmler saw themselves had this idea of a united Europe, of actually creating a system that they would take. That every country in Europe would have Aryans, people who were of the certain stock, right? Because the Germans had overrun the end of the Roman Empire. They'd gone into Italy. The northern Italians would be counted as Aryans. Some of the people in Spain, a lot of the people in France, and of course the British and the Scandinavians, and of course they might have then, I mean, you even had the what was it? The Viking SS division had Ukrainians in it, I think. So you had people who were considered Aryans in all these countries. And the SS, people forget that the SS was the first pan-European army maybe since the Roman legions, when the Roman legions were made up of not just Romans, but people from all over Europe. Um, and so it was, they were really going to try to integrate then Europe economically. And of course, Europe has more people than the United States. And if it had access to resources, the resources of Eurasia, like the conquered Soviet Union, the Baku oil fields, in addition to the Romanian oil fields and the minerals of the former Soviet Union, this would make a powerful combination. Um, uh, but of course, you have to actually conquer it, which is a problem. And of course, Hitler, in the Hitler second book that you mentioned, he's got this rather Darwinian nations or peoples. They kill or be killed. They exterminate. They survive. And he saw countries like the Soviet Union and the United States, because of their size, being the countries of the future, and the British Empire. And he liked the idea of the British Empire because it's white people ruling over people who aren't white. But he thought that Germany needed the same thing. Germany needed to have
Yeah.
not just Lebensraum, but the territory that was defensible and that contained all the raw materials to make an autarky, right? Because Hitler's economic thinking was, and what our autarky means is economically self-sufficient in itself, so that it could go to war and not be blockaded, not be strangled, and build itself up.
Now, what would you say is what do you think people should be aware of in terms of America being penetrated by Soviet intelligence before World War II? Because many people they know about the Cold War era, and they know about the moles that were exposed in the Cold War. But what about before World War II? I mean, what was the situation before the war in terms of communist Soviet agents in America?
Well, we have a number of good books about this. One is Stalin's Secret Agents, which more covers World War II than the 30s, but it also gives you the idea. There is also Diana West's book, which is American Betrayal, which gives a good overview. And in this book, you will find that, the testimony of William Wirt, who was an educator in America, who these communists kind of spoke freely to him at a party about how Roosevelt wasn't one of them, but he was going to help them, and they were going to use him to take power in the U.S., and that the New Deal here, when the Depression hit, Roosevelt beats Hoover in the 1932 election, and you already have phenomena like the Bonus Army, which was this group of World War I veterans that were camping near Washington, and they were gathering, and they, Smedley Butler was one of the leaders, if I remember correctly, and of course, we didn't really find out what Herbert Hoover knew when his memoirs, his sort of his magnum opus was published. I think it was 10 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. His papers were really kept in secret. They published them, and I read them, and he said, look, the FBI knew back then that it was very dangerous, that the Bonus Army was, the communists were behind it. And he writes this in his thing, saying, and he warned FDR that these communists were dangerous. They would try to use anything to take over and to not have diplomatic relations with Russia, because once you have an embassy and once you have consulates on American soil, they become centers of plotting, espionage, and organizing, communist groups here on American soil. And it was, people don't realize the communists were extremely active after World War I. That we had communist snipers shooting at doughboys on parades coming home from World War I in California. There's such an incident that they thought there was going to be a revolution in America, the Red Scare. Communists threw a bomb through Attorney General Palmer's living room window, blew out the front of his house. So it was a serious thing that we took seriously. In 1923, here in northern Michigan, there was a group of choirs meeting. There were hundreds of people meeting, and they depicted themselves as choirs. It was a giant communist meeting where they had this summer camp up here, where they were educating themselves. They were doing classes on how to take over your town council, your board of supervisors, your county government, your church, local civic organizations, how to infiltrate everywhere. And people locally up here got suspicious. It wasn't really that far from where I am right now. And I believe it was the Michigan National Guard. There's a book called Reds in America, written by a guy named Whitney about this. They came up and they raided the camp after most of these people had left. And they found, I think it was 60 barrels filled with documents on how to take over the country, all from the grassroots on up. And people were shocked. It's like, they're really serious. And of course, taking over education. And this was but Roosevelt, despite Hoover's warnings to him, don't engage with the Soviet Union, he recognized the Soviet Union in
Mm-hmm.
October 1933, set up an embassy, was very friendly with them, very naive about it. And so and of course, from that point on, you had a guy in the White House whose wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was almost a communist. I mean, she was so
Yeah,
sympathetic with communism.
didn't a guy, one of the Roosevelts. This was, I think, in the 18. I don't exactly remember what. This was in the 1830s, 1840s, maybe. I think his name was Clinton Roosevelt, and he published a book on socialism before Karl Marx actually had published his Capital. And if people can find this text nowadays on the web, if people read Clinton Roosevelt's concept of socialism, it's basically the same as Marx, even though it's written in a clear and simple language. It's not this outrageous gibberish that Karl Marx had put forward. So yeah, I think that that goes back even further, possibly in the Roosevelt family.
Well, yeah, one thing I can comment in America in terms of subversion of because America was a frontier society, there were always people who had communist ideas or socialist ideas. And there were many experiments here in America
Right.
where people set up communities. I think Mark Twain even joked about it in some of his writings, that they would set up these communities where everybody was going to share everything.
Yeah.
And of course, these experiments always failed and ended disastrously. And it sort of became there are books about it,
A running joke.
where if you want to read but it's always the same dismal story that the experiment in trying to live, and share everything in common never really works out. And I think in America, more than any other country, we experimented with this, by people doing it freely on their own. Um, so yeah, and then what happened was that the FBI was very vigilant in those days under J. Edgar Hoover, not President Hoover, the head of the FBI. They said that they estimated, and I'm not sure, this was a report that came out, I think it was in 1936 or 37, that there were 5,000 communist or communist sympathizers in the federal government working at different levels as employees, secretaries, whatever. And that something had to be done about it. And FDR made fun of this. And he said, some of my best friends are communists, something like that. And then you had this Texas congressman who actually started the House Un-American Activities Committee. And his name escapes me right now, but he was a Democrat. He wasn't a Republican. He was investigating Nazis and communists. And he got called into the White House more than once saying, it's great that you go after the Nazis, but we don't want you going after the communists.
Right.
And you can read about, his experiences. He wrote about this. And I've read excerpts from his writings. He was the guy that when Senator Joseph McCarthy got interested in communism, he went and had dinner with him. And he actually told McCarthy, he goes, this is really dangerous. If you go into this, you're going to have a lot of Americans against you because
Yeah.
this thing is stronger than you realize.
And
So,
also,
yeah,
yeah,
America was penetrated, yes.
and also, people need to remember that the Soviet war production, to a large degree, was based on American technology. Now, some people may be familiar with the literature done later by Anthony Sutton. I think he was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford for a while. And now Anthony Sutton, he collected a lot of data concerning technology sales to the Soviet Union. And it's an interesting
and to
collection.
Germany, by the way,
and
to Germany.
And to Germany, and it's an interesting collection of data. I just strongly disagree with his interpretation of the data because he came up with this idea that America wanted to build up these enemies and to then destroy these enemies and somehow profiting and benefiting from that a
Yeah.
whole lot.
No,
And this
that
sort of
there was
yeah, and
nobody
this
in a position of
yeah, and
authority
this
that thought that way.
and this interpretation even got worse when Sutton became interested in communist China. He wanted to extend this interpretation to communist China, as if anybody would be dumb enough to build up two large enemies: Soviet Russia and communist China. You know, America building up two great enemies that soon became, you know, atomic powers, building them up to defeat them. That this is not, you know, to
Yeah,
have this
this is
big
why
war.
Anthony Sutton's a poor social scientist who didn't really understand political sociology at all. What he didn't understand is that capitalists make deals with people to make money. That's what they do. They don't really capitalists are such monomaniacs. They're focused on their business. They're focused on the making of money, and the fact that they are a byproduct of this is that enemies are built up. They're they're not really aware of it like we are. And so then to turn that stupidity, that capitalist stupidity, into a conspiracy is a misreading of history,
Yeah.
which I think is important to say. I mean, look, a lot of people in America, and the Bush family is an example. They were involved in it. A lot of Wall Street people were investing in the Third Reich, right? And there were people that were investing in this. So there were American engineers and that went over to the Soviet Union and helped them build things. I mean, much of what was built in the Soviet Union and Germany came from America.
Yeah, and also there was a lot of covering up in these left wing American newspapers. A lot of covering up for what was going on in the Soviet Union, especially the Gulag system, which even became a thing in 1920 roundabout. And
Yeah,
there
the
was this
Ukraine
movie.
famine.
Yeah, there was this
Yeah.
movie. There was this movie made on. This was pretty. This was a pretty good one. I think this was even a Ukrainian production a couple of years ago. People can find that on Amazon Prime and these other streaming platforms. I don't remember the exact title, but I watched it with my wife. It's about this guy who is almost a bit of a spy, and he goes to Soviet Union. At first, he's in the capital in Russia there, and he sees all these star journalists from the New York Times and all these other publications. And these so-called journalists, they're not really doing any investigating. They're not really covering
They're
what's
having
going on.
orgies
They're
and
having
using drugs
they're having orgies. There's gay
in
journalists, and they're having
Moscow.
fun in
Yeah.
Moscow, and they're having fun. And they are writing these puff pieces. They send them home, and they get published in America. So Americans didn't really know what was going on in Soviet Russia. And this one guy, he actually has, I think, Ukrainian relatives, or his Ukrainian mother or something, and he sneaks his way into Soviet Ukraine, and he stumbles upon the Holodomor, the engineered famine. You know, this complete and utter ethnic cleansing genocide that the Russians were conducting in Ukraine. So he has this little camera, and he starts shooting photos, and he sees all these dead people, and he finds the hometown of I don't know if it was his mother or anything, and he gets caught. He sort of gets out of Russia, and the papers do not want to run his stories at first, and this actually took a while until the truth actually was
Yeah, both
published.
are British because you see what had happened in the 1920s is that all these countries developed would have never recognized the Soviet Union except that the Soviets did this Operation Trust, and Lenin had the NEP, the New Economic Policy, where they retreated into capitalism, and people thought, oh, the Soviet Union is becoming a normal country because communism doesn't work, and so they opened trade. The British opened trade, the Germans, the French, the Scandinavians. This was a mistake because NEP was they were just doing it temporarily to build up strength, that there was no real monarchist alliance of Central Russia that was going to turn Russia into a monarchy again. And so they were all fooled. And once they got into trading with Russia, they were making money. They didn't want to stop. And so then you had powerful, and then you had the politicians that would be embarrassed by their mistake, that didn't want to admit it. And of course, the big American journalist who won, I think he won a Pulitzer Prize. Yeah, he did. Walter Duranty
Yeah.
was a New York Times correspondent in Moscow, and he's depicted in this film. This film, by the way, that you're talking about, is a true story. And this British journalist that went and discovered the Holodomor, he stuck to his guns, but he did, his career came to an end
Mm-hmm.
basically as a journalist because he wanted to talk about this. And of course, the terror famine. We've got Robert Conquest's book here, The Harvest of Sorrow, about how 7 to 11 million Ukrainians were systematically murdered in a terror famine to force the agriculture, to collectivize the agriculture, to put agriculture under a communist system of control. And of course, I should mention Walter Duranty, the journalist who told all these lies about how good the Soviet Union was, covered up all their crimes in the 1920s and 30s. He met Aleister Crowley in
No
Paris,
way.
I think in 1919. Yes, he did. And he participated in magical rituals
Oh
with
God.
Aleister Crowley. I'm not kidding. This
Holy
is so I
moly.
just thought because we'd covered this, so there's
Yeah.
always these cross currents,
Yeah.
right? With these people who are basically agents of
Yeah,
the bad guys.
the world is a small place. Well, Crowley,
Yeah,
Aleister Crowley leads us directly to Britain, or as it was known back then, the British Empire, because Britain, in the 1920s and 1930s, Britain was still a massive empire. I think when the war ended, Britain was officially in control of 700 million people worldwide. Now, of course, this was a weird empire because it was not a continental, large territory such as America, but it was these tiny little islands, the British islands in Europe. And then, of course, you had these colonies that were not as stable as Britain would have liked. So that's a very strange empire.
yeah,
And also, there was always the threat of the British islands being overrun. This threat has always been there, especially since the Napoleonic era, and so that was always a concern to the British. And so at the time, Britain knew that the Germans were angry at them, and that's why Britain, as well as the Russians, they spread this conspiracy propaganda, telling people that it was the Jews that were responsible for World War I, and not all these other factors and players and dynamics, right? So this was one of the ideas that the British had, sort of to mitigate the risk of German revenge and maybe French revenge. Okay, so the nightmare for the British was clearly some sort of an alliance or a deal between the French, the French and the Germans, because if those two got together, they could have overrun the British islands, and that would have probably been the end of the British Empire. So that was kind of where the British were at. And also, there's this factor which the Germans were not really aware of, and that's these older aristocratic intelligence networks, and they were all over Germany because various German territories used to be the home, or the original home, of many of these aristocratic families that ruled Britain. So you go to Mecklenburg, you go to Schleswig-Holstein, you go to Hessen, you go to Hanover. These places in Germany, this is the origin of what later became the British Empire. And so it was exactly those aristocratic families that were happy to spread conspiracy propaganda about Jews in the right wing circles, the Völkische movement. Okay, so this was in the later 1800s, and this was copied verbatim by the National Socialist Party. They were basing their entire view on history on that conspiracy narrative, and building on that conspiracy narrative, the British, or let's say the aristocratic British, they created this deception. This is what Louis Kilzer wrote about in his book Churchill's Deception, and also his book about Martin Bormann, Hitler's traitor. It was sort of this charade, this theater, pretending to like the National Socialists. So these were these British circles that pretended to be sympathetic to fascism.
But they really weren't sympathetic. Is
No,
that right?
no, because I mean, clearly, when the Nazis took power, they loved their British contacts. They always visited the British, and they had high-ranking British visitors in Germany. And so they would tell these British, we like you, we love you, we think we are one Nordic people, and we need to stick together. And there was also this concept, but the British, they even told the Germans, look, we don't want Germany to triple in size because that makes us British nervous. You must understand that, dear National Socialists. But they wouldn't want to hear it. So the British kept playing into this Nazi wishful thinking. And that sort of created an intelligence problem for the British, because all that schmoozing with the fascists scared a lot of people in Britain, especially the younger generations.
Yeah, the British actually sent an ambassador, Neville Henderson, to Germany, to the Third Reich. And Henderson was really very like the Germans. And he became rather close friends with Hermann Goering. And Henderson was one of these people that was sent there to manage a German relationship. They needed somebody who was really friendly and liked the Nazis. And it's interesting to watch. There's newsreels of Henderson after the war started talking about the nature of Hitler and Goering afterwards, which is very interesting. He wrote a book afterwards too, which is really interesting. Perhaps one of the most intriguing characters, diplomatic characters of the war. And maybe we can get back to when the war started. He actually tried to throw a tantrum in front of Hitler rather than Hitler throwing a tantrum. And that's an interesting story in itself. And of course, Hitler did not react. He just sat there very calmly. Mm-hmm. And Henderson was going, I couldn't ruffle the guy. Yeah. I couldn't. He was very calm.
Yeah,
which meant that Hitler was acting when he was doing it too, throwing tantrums.
But anyway,
the British had this. Yeah.
Some of these younger British, they came from these old families. They went to Cambridge. They went to these elite universities. But they were not in the loop, so to say. They did not know about this deception maneuver that was concocted by Winston Churchill, the King, and others. And so these young people at these elite universities, they became scared of fascism. They thought that Britain was going into that fascist direction, and that's why Soviet intelligence could use that fear and recruit young British men from these upper circles. And this is ultimately what became
a genuine fascist movement in Britain under Oswald Mosley.
People should check out.
Yeah, what were the sisters that Hitler was close to these people? One of them, I think, committed suicide or tried right after the war started because of the war between the two countries that they loved, And I think most of these people were interned. Was it on the Isle of Wight that they were interned in a camp during the war?
Something like that, yeah. And it was such a convincing charade, and some of these British probably even were not in the loop themselves. They were taking part in this, and they were probably believing in it. But some of these young British, they became so worried, they started to spy for the Soviets, and this ultimately became the Cambridge Five, the Cambridge spy ring. They were Philby, Burgess,
Roger
McLean,
Hollis,
Anthony Blunt, these people. They were so afraid of fascism, and they didn't understand the Soviet threat because they didn't understand the Soviet Union enough. So that became sort of an intelligence problem for the British. But they still had, these aristocratic assets on German territory, and we later found out that when the Second World War was over, Lord Louis Mountbatten had inherited the task of managing these secret communication channels, between Britain and Germany, between these aristocrats. And so Lord Louis Mountbatten, he sent Anthony Blunt of all people, to collect these secret correspondence papers to go to Germany and collect all these papers from these various castles and bring them home to Britain. But we have to consider the possibility that Anthony Blunt gave copies of everything to the Soviets. And of course, that became sort of this great suspicion against Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was so high up the chain, and he became so involved in NATO. He had communist contacts, and he was considered compromised by British intelligence professionals, French intelligence professionals, and even the FBI. The FBI opened a file on Lord Louis Mountbatten, and this man, through his relatives on the throne, he had access to all British intelligence and some American intelligence because of these shared projects.
So Britain was penetrated, America was penetrated. And of course, you had Harry Hopkins, who actually lived in the White House, who people called him a co-president, who was, many people believe he was Agent 19. There was a study done showing that he had to be the agent, the top agent feeding information. You had Alger Hiss in the State Department. You had Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department, who was thought to be responsible for helping to bring about a war between Japan and the United States by provoking Pearl Harbor by a communique that he wrote when we imposed sanctions on Japan in 1941. So both countries are, and Germany's penetrated.
Oh boy!
And maybe you can speak to that about people like Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo.
Well, the situation was so dire after World War I. I mean, people have to imagine not just the war was lost. Germany had very soon become demilitarized. I mean, there was no military to speak of, and
they were allowed to keep, I think, 100,000 troops. I think
something like that. And there was nothing
after having millions under arms.
Yeah, then the Treaty of Versailles, all these payments that had to be made, and all these restrictions put on the German military. So there was a whole laundry list of what the Germans couldn't have and couldn't build, and this and that. So this was not just the only problem. You saw a breakdown of counterintelligence, and you also saw a breakdown of the economy. You had communist circles spreading everywhere in Germany. This even happened at the end of World War I, when these military officers started to disobey orders, and all these little communist little republics kept popping up everywhere, all over Germany. So this is in Hamburg, this is in other places, for a time in Munich. All these places where suddenly communists are taking over the buildings of government, and they form their own little communist mini country, so to say. It's like sometimes it was a city, sometimes it was less than a city, but this happened everywhere. So that's when you saw these so-called Freikorps groups coming into form. These were former soldiers, these veterans, and some of these new kids, like Martin Bormann, or one of my ancestors, Theo Benesch. He was almost too young to fight in World War I. So they all became involved with this new radical movement. But the situation was so dire at the time, especially financially, that this created an intelligence nightmare, because many people could be bought by the Soviets, either by direct payments or by, let's say, help in advancing a career, because you didn't know what your life was going to be like. If you're 20 years old, or you're 25, you're 30 years old, you don't know what the future will hold, and there's these people that offer you opportunities, and they offer you money, and they can get you started. So we saw almost complete breakdown of counterintelligence. Now, a lot has been written and said about these right-wing or ultra-right-wing Freikorps groups. And if you were involved in those, like Martin Bormann was very young, if you were involved in those early, you had a great shot at a huge career in the National Socialist Party. The earlier you joined and the more loyalty you showed, the more prospects you had for a career. But if Soviet intelligence had recruited these young Germans, Soviet intelligence could get these young people to rise up higher and higher and higher, especially in the National Socialist Party. And that, to this very day, that has never been properly reconstructed. There's almost nobody who would ever touch this topic, this insane infiltration of Germany before the war, because apparently, the Second World War is such a touchy subject in connection with the Holocaust, so nobody really wants to mess with the Russians when it comes to this. Because if somebody put out a study on this, and this gained traction and became a public phenomenon, this would create a massive diplomatic incident. The Russians would absolutely not tolerate this. If you told the history of that.
It's what people don't understand about Germany in this period was that what we're seeing today in Germany, in the United States, for example, is this far left, far right convergence where the middle is being torn apart and the society is being polarized and divided. And this is what happened in Weimar Germany. And a lot of people don't realize that the German rebellion, the Nazi Party uprising in Bavaria in November 1923, was originally coordinated with Karl Radek, meeting with top Nazi officials, saying there was going to be a simultaneous uprising in Berlin. Now, they were hoping to make Bavaria like a separate republic, but the communists were actually thinking in terms of a revolution sort of ostensibly right-wing revolution in Bavaria that would be aligned with the communists taking over Berlin. At the time, the Nazis didn't have any position in Prussia, in the main part of Germany, in the north and the east, but they had this in Bavaria. So this is very interesting. And Viktor Suvorov, in his book *The Chief Culprit*, mentions this coordination in the two revolutions. He actually mentions, the Bolshevik Revolution, it actually happened on November 7th, right? And what was the date of the Nazi Revolution? And what was the date of the Munich Beer Hall push? See, there's similarities in dates. He actually has this section where he writes about the similarities between the Nazis, and this is where convergence comes in. This is rather brilliant. He writes as follows: Hitler had a red flag. Stalin had a red flag. Hitler ruled in the name of the workers' class. His party was called the Workers' Party. Stalin also ruled in the name of the workers' class. Hitler hated democracy and struggled against it. Stalin hated democracy and struggled against it. Hitler was building socialism, and Stalin was building socialism. Under the title of socialism, Hitler saw a classless society. So did Stalin. Hitler held his road to socialism as the only correct one. Stalin also held his road to socialism was uniquely correct. Hitler mercilessly destroyed all his party comrades, such as Rem and his followers, when they strayed from the correct path. Stalin also mercilessly destroyed all who strayed from the correct path. Hitler had a 4-year plan. Stalin had a 5-year plan. In Hitler's Germany, one party was in power, the others in jail. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, one party was in power, the others in jail, and so on. I mean, he goes on, and he can go on for a page and a half like this. The similarities are amazing. And Hitler himself actually bragged that some of the best National Socialists had been recruited from the ranks of the communists.
Yeah. And also a lot has been written about how the Nazis were collecting dirt against each other. So this became almost like a sport, with the NSDAP. So everybody was collecting incriminating evidence against everybody and was stashing it somewhere, sometimes even in foreign countries where the information was safe. You had all these dead man switches. If something happens to me, this information gets released and all that sort of stuff. And so when you mix when you have all these communist Soviet spies inside of Germany, that of course makes it likely that most of this information found its way to Moscow, and they could also use it on German soil to advance somebody's career and to stop somebody else's career. And we mentioned this in one of the last shows about Adolf Hitler himself. Adolf Hitler possibly poisoned his own father because he hated him, and his father didn't want him to become an artist, and so Hitler may have poisoned his own father. And the 2008 study by Lothar Machtan was very convincing. It was about Hitler's sexuality and the espionage aspects of it, and so we know that Röhm, everybody knows Röhm was gay, and he wasn't the only gay official of a high standing in the Nazi party.
The SA, which was the stormtroopers, the Nazi stormtroopers, were there were many homosexuals in the SA.
Yeah, the gay centers were Munich and Berlin. So this had, especially in the 1920s, there was a large gay scene in Berlin and Munich and also in Vienna. And so these people knew each other. And when it comes to Adolf Hitler, he did have some limited attraction to women in a weird fashion. That's what the Americans figured out in their assessments of Hitler's personality. He had some sort of weird fetishes about women. But when you look at the study by Lothar Machtan, it's very convincing. For the most part, Adolf Hitler was gay, and he always was around.
Well, there's also, I should mention, Ernst Hamstengel's book.
Oh, he collected stuff.
Yeah, he was an American German. I believe his mother's side of the family was American. They had a business that was in New York and Bavaria, and he was very educated. He played the piano beautifully, and Hitler really loved his piano playing, soothed Hitler. He became friends with Hitler early, and he was trying to get Hitler away from the anti-Semitism part of it. In fact, he even tried to introduce Hitler to Churchill in the early days of the Nazi movement. But Hamstengel describes Hitler's sexuality, and Hitler would pretend to be in love with Hamstengel's wife, and he often went to their house for dinner and so on. And Hamstengel's wife's reaction to Hitler's pretending to love her beauty and whatever was, he's a neuter. Hitler's a neuter, she called him. That is, he's sexually a nothing. Very peculiar thing that his wife said about him. And he also spoke often about there was something wrong with Hitler sexually.
Yeah.
And this is scattered throughout Hamstengel's memoirs.
And there were police files, various types of police files about Hitler from his early days when he was not a politician. Police files in Vienna, police files in Munich, and we know that from, among others, Lothar Machtan's study. There was this one military officer in Germany. He had copies of police files on Hitler, including photos and all of that, and so this was used as protection. But there was also this one scientist. He was sort of a left-wing scientist, and he was an expert on sexual research, and he collected police files and put everything into a package and had it sent to Moscow, essentially. So we have to assume that the Russians had this material as well, and so there were all this incriminating material that was going around, and when Hitler took power, he immediately tried to find as much of this material as possible. So there's, especially after the Röhm Putsch, these soldiers, they were breaking into all kinds of houses and opening all these safes and to find incriminating material and just to remove it and destroy it. So that was kind of this insane counterintelligence fiasco that was happening in Germany. And some people might say, well, but wasn't there an economic rebound? Why wasn't money wasn't the money good at some point? The economy was good. this would have made it harder for the Soviets to buy people, just to recruit people with money. Well, there was an economic rebound, of course, in the 1930s. This was the so-called Reinhardt program. This was based on the British Baron John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics and all that. So with that program, Germany was out of crisis mode by 1936. So that's a couple of years before the war. But there was still many problems. It was still
and they were back in crisis in 1938.
Yeah, there was still many problems, and there was also a large issue with debt. So they had this official Hjalmar Schacht, and in 1933 he created this sort of you could call it a credit default swap. It's sort of this way of creating debt and not call it debt. So this was a handy dandy tool. It almost created a parallel currency besides the Reichsmark, and this is how they financed the army and all the military goods. But this, of course, created all kinds of problems, and many people warned Hitler about this debt, and they suggested to Hitler that certain goods should not be produced anymore. Luxurious goods, the prices had to be adjusted to reality, but Hitler was strongly against it because he figured that the people will love him as long as these prices are good and the market seems fine and everybody can buy all these different goods. So this was sort of Hitler's opinion on that. But overall, Germany was falling behind. Germany was especially falling behind the United States because in America by that time, the Americans, they could mass produce quality vehicles, quality cars, and make a profit on it. Now, it seems like a no-brainer, these days. Of course, car companies make profits, but this was not a given, especially at the time, especially in Germany. So the Germans, the Nazis, they were not able to actually mass produce cars and make a profit. They had this idea of making what later became the Volkswagen Beetle. Now, if people remember the old Beetle car, it was this round little funny looking car, had a pretty weak engine, I think it was air cooled, and so the earlier iteration of that car was called the KDF car. This stood for Kraft durch Freude. This means power through joy, right? This was the idiotic name they were giving this car, and they wanted to mass produce it for the population, but according to their own calculations, they would make a significant loss on each car they produce and sell. Same problem in the housing market. There were just not enough apartments for people. I mean, Hitler wanted the Germans to make babies and create all these new warriors and workers, but there was just no space for these people. There were no apartments for them, and so they figured they could build new apartments, but they would be very small, no kitchen, no bathroom, no central heating, no running hot water. Compared this to America, the United States, where even the lowest paid guy at a Ford or GM automotive plant, even the lowest paid guy in America could have like 4-room apartment and running water and his own kitchen and real toilet, his own toilet. So this was sort of the underlying problem that people didn't really see, and many Germans didn't even own a radio. This is something that became more widespread when the Germans actually made a cheaper radio, the so-called Volksempfänger, the people's radio. But it was just not many people had a radio for a very long time. And the Americans by that time, they had radios. Americans had telephones. This was becoming very common. You could have a Sears catalog in America and just mail order all these cool items, all these cool things. You didn't have that in Germany. And so there was just no competitive products coming out of Germany for the world market. So by doing these calculations, Germany kept falling behind, and there was another big problem, which was the farming sector, because roughly a third of the German economy was still farming. And for farming, you need space. You need more space to produce more grain or potatoes or whatever. But Germany just did not have the space. Now, when Hitler was talking about Lebensraum in his book Mein Kampf, the living space in the East, this was not just his grandiose idea of having a large population. This was not just ideology. It was just straight up economics. And I would suggest people read this book called Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze. Now, he's specialized in these topics, and he just dissected the whole economic reality of Nazi Germany. And he estimates that Germany, at the time, Germany was behind the United States by about 25 to 30 years. 25 to 30 years behind, and things were not looking good. They were not catching up. They were even falling further behind. So this was also one of the reasons ultimately for this decision to invade Poland and to go east. This was also the economics.
Well, let me suggest another cause of this, because I was interested. I did a sort of a private study where I tried to figure out what were Hitler's motives when. And so Hitler would make these casual comments to Goebbels or other Nazis about his intentions. And he would say, for example, well, when we go to war with the Soviet Union, Poland and Italy are going to be my allies. This was kind of what he wanted to do. And he asked France for a non-aggression pact. He wanted to demilitarize the French-German border, but of course the French turned him down and decided to make some agreements with the Soviet Union. And Hitler, of course, pretended to be a man of peace. But behind the scenes, the way they were building up their military, it looked like they were looking at to start the war in 41, 42. They would have the weapons they wanted. But in 1937, there was a guy named Felix Kirsten, who was a German who acquired Finnish nationality. He fought in the Finnish Civil War, where the one civil war in the former Russian Empire where the Reds lost. And so he learned Chinese medicine and massage from a Chinese doctor in Germany, and he became very skilled at it. He had very lucrative clients. I think the royal family in Holland. He had Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Ciano, was one of his clients, and ultimately Himmler, the head of the SS, became one of Felix Kirsten's clients. He didn't want him, but when you get invited to, what was it, Prince Albrechtstrasse, where the headquarters of the SS was, if I'm remembering the street they were located on correctly, that you can't turn it down. It's not safe. And of course, he ended up becoming then an intimate, because he was the only person who could cure. Himmler had a bad conscience, as you might imagine a mass murderer would. And when he would do evil things, he would get massive cramping of his stomach and his intestines. And the only way this stress would be relieved would be Felix Kirsten to administer to him. So there's a book, I think The Man with the Magical Hands, I think is the title of the book, but it's Felix Kirsten's story. And he was shown at one point, Himmler had behind his desk, he had a wall safe. And one day he opened it up, and Himmler was very upset. And it was during the war. And he said, I need you to see this. This document was made in 1937. And I think it was two doctors did this. They had a physical examination of Hitler. And it was their opinion that Hitler had just entered into early stages of syphilis. Yeah. That he was headed for syphilitic psychosis, or syphilitic paralysis, because it heads towards this. And that, and of course, what's interesting, in November of 1937 is when Hitler sort of had this first meeting of his generals and admirals and saying, we got to get ready for war. We're going to be more aggressive. We're going to do different things. We're going to have enemies. And of course, I think there's a relationship. And by the way, Walter Schellenberg also was shown the same 28, 29 page medical report on Hitler. So Schellenberg was shown this by Hitler too. Schellenberg was quite close to Himmler. And that it greatly upset Heinrich Himmler because he knew that Hitler, and then we've got Hitler's regular doctor, Dr. Morell. And Dr. Morell was a specialist at treating syphilis. And I think Dr. Morell started going to work with him in 37 or 38. You could correct me if I'm wrong on that. And of course, what was his treatment of Hitler? He gave these little pills to Hitler, and they were, I think it was strychnine, which was a small doses of it, not lethal, but it was sort of like chemo for syphilis, and it would retard the advance of the disease, but also it had some harmful effects on the patient. And so it would keep the disease at bay. And then, of course, people later were saying, well, Hitler had didn't have syphilis. He had
Parkinson's or something.
Yeah, Parkinson's, right? When they show his hand shaking. Well, the thing is they can mimic each other because it's a neurological disease.
Degenerative.
And when you go to, there is ego inflation and a mania that goes with syphilis. And of course, this was the thing that Schellenberg felt. Schellenberg was urging Himmler behind Hitler's back to overthrow Hitler, to make him retire for reasons of health. This is towards the end of the war. People were trying to bring this war to an end early. But I think that perhaps the fact that Hitler got aggressive and seems to have, people said, some biographers say that Hitler was really disappointed by Munich in 1938 because he wanted the war to begin then.
Yeah,
right? Have you heard this?
Well, he was. I mean, I'm also convinced that he felt he was running out of time. There were quite a few people that were told directly by Hitler that he wasn't going to be around for much longer. That his successors would continue his work, and he always wanted to. He wanted to make these territorial gains, build these gigantic structures, have a new city, a new capital built, and these outrageous buildings created so that everybody would remember him after his death, so he wouldn't be forgotten and his successor wouldn't outshine him in any way. So this was, I mean, the clock was definitely ticking for him, and so there was his health. There was sort of this idea of a window of opportunity, and of course, I just mentioned the economic factors. So the clock was definitely ticking, not just for Hitler, but also for Germany as an empire. Germany hadn't been a real empire for the longest time. It was just these mini kingdoms, and you had a count here and a prince there, and they were all sort of different. And in 1871, that was the first time you actually had some sort of a unified empire, which was not that unified because all these different aristocratic lines, they had sort of their own ideas. So it was either expand the empire and have the space and get what the empire needed, which was oil and steel and a place to grow. A place to grow grain, get what you need, and the aggressiveness that was required. This was sort of the only way you could have an empire in the future. So the choice was just move along and not be aggressive and have zero chance of a successful empire, or take your chances, have a war, and hope for the best. And this was considered to be the only shot at an empire, to have an empire in the future. Mm-hmm. And in 2015, an interesting book came out. I don't know if there's an English version of it. It was done by Carina Urbach, and it's called Hitlers heimliche Helfer, Hitler's secret helpers. And this was almost one of the first real studies done on the role of the aristocracy in the Nazi party, because all these aristocrats, they happily joined the Nazi party, and that was a huge factor in not just the success of the Nazi Party, but also the war, because having these aristocrats on board gave Hitler, or gave the impression of legitimacy to Hitler, not just in the broad population, but also within the party and among the generals, because the generals, there were almost all of them were aristocrats too, from these very high-ranking old families. And also these aristocratic families, especially, like you had Prince Philip von Hessen. You know, he was managing Nazi relations to Italy, Mussolini, and the King of Italy. And also there was Karl Eduard Herzog von Sachsen, Coburg und Gotha. He was related to Queen Victoria, and he joined the Nazi Party very early in the game, and he managed relations between Hitler and the English kings Edward VIII and George VI. So with his diplomacy behind the scenes, he created the impression that Britain could actually join Germany, especially when it came to the war against Poland, the Blitzkrieg invasion of Poland. This created the impression that the British would not really intervene. So this was the wishful thinking that you could take Poland and not really get into much trouble with the British. And if the British don't really get active, the French will not really get active. And that also played an important part.
That's true. We should mention appeasement policy and Neville Chamberlain briefly here. Neville Chamberlain and the British may be part of this deception, but they thought if Hitler, it's fine with us, basically. This is Neville Chamberlain. If Hitler wants to go and attack the Soviet Union, they're not a country we like either. If that's what he wants to do, fine. Let's make sure he feels comfortable with us, that we satisfy him. And of course, you had in March 1938, you had the Anschluss, where they just sort of bum rushed Austria and took it over. And there was no real resistance in Austria. Austria had been a sort of conservative dictatorship before then. And of course, that was successful. And then on the heels of this, Hitler immediately starts plotting on Sudetenland and talking about invading Czechoslovakia. And this leads to the Czech crisis, where Neville Chamberlain flies to Munich, and they have this big, they're very close to war. They're thinking there's going to be this war because Hitler is, basically just practically, falling on the ground, foaming at the mouth, chewing the carpet. This is the joke about Hitler that people say in the West. But Neville Chamberlain gets this agreement that Germany gets the parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, that are those parts that are German. And then he promises he's not going to go after anything more. Hitler sort of promised the British and said, my demands are done. This is it. This is all I want. And of course, they go through this, but the Allies, they knew, the British and the French knew that they couldn't really trust him. And what happened in November of 1938, after this agreement was signed, was the Kristallnacht, where you had this
long knives.
Yeah, well, the Kristallnacht in 1938, in which the Jewish shops were attacked and Jews were, and this was shocking to people in the West. And in January of 1939, I think it was January, Halifax, who was the British foreign minister, and Chamberlain went to see Mussolini in Rome. And obviously Hitler was going to find this out. And Hitler had been, on May 5th, 1938, Hitler had a trip to Rome where he tried to make this agreement. And Mussolini was kind of, sort of, yeah, okay, kind of, sort of. It wasn't really firm. And so there was this fighting over because Italy was with the Allies in World War I. And so it wasn't really clear. And of course, Hitler was grateful to Mussolini for not intervening in the Anschluss, because remember, Mussolini had forbidden Hitler from taking Austria up until a certain point. And then he allowed this. And Hitler said publicly he felt all this gratitude to Mussolini. This is sort of how this this relationship started to develop. So you had this tussle over what side Italy is going to be on if there's a war. So the British weren't completely naive. But then when appeasement policy ended was March of 1939, what does Hitler do? You have the Czechoslovakia split. The Slovaks didn't want anything to do with the Czechs. The Czechs had been rather dominant within the Czechoslovakian political system, and a lot of the ethnic minorities within the Czechoslovak state felt that the Czechs unfairly dominated within this polity. And so the Slovaks made an alliance with Hitler. They came on board with Hitler. And then you had the Czech rump state. It's just Czechia, very small, Bohemia, Moravia. And you have Hungary wants a chunk of that, right? Poland wanted a chunk of that. And so Germany's thinking, these other countries are going to, and by the way, it's the Czechs are hardworking Slavs who had this industrial region in their territory that, as a matter of fact, the Czech Panzer 38 is a great tank. It's probably better than all the German tanks.
Yeah, the Skoda factories, and other...
Skoda works.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and so this was a prize. And so Hitler in March of 1938, he got the leading politician in Czechia to come to Berlin, and he really intimidated the guy, and he browbeat the guy into surrendering his country as a Reich protectorate of Moravia and Bohemia, I think is what they called it. Isn't that right?
I think so, yeah. I mean...
yeah. And so then he just invaded it, and the British public regarded it as a betrayal. And when Chamberlain went to say, well, we need to continue appeasement policy because we want Hitler's aggression focused east, not on the west, the British public said, no, we are done trusting Hitler. And then the pressure was on. Churchill's stock was rising, and it was Poland, and the corridor crisis came next. And maybe you could explain what the Polish corridor was and why that was important.
Well, the Germany in the past was bigger, considerably bigger. There was what they call it the corridor. It's a stretch of territory right at the what we call the Ostsee, the ocean in the north, and
the Baltic Sea.
Exactly. So Kaliningrad, Königsberg, this is some of the territories now in possession of Russia, by the way. This is a small bit of Russia that sits very close to Germany, if people are not aware of that.
Kaliningrad used to be the German city of Königsberg.
Right, and so there was what they call East Prussia, Ostpreußen. This was sort of the backcountry area of Germany, and they had this man in charge of East Prussia. I think his name was Erich Koch, and there's a really good book on him that came out a few years ago. And so he was this hyper ambitious man who had these aristocratic friends, and he wanted a command. He wanted to rule over part of Germany, and he got to rule this corridor, but part of this eastern corridor basically of Germany. And when these further wars happened, he became in charge of occupied Poland and later occupied Ukraine. So he became the biggest territorial master within the Nazi system.
Some of my Ukrainian friends think that he was a Soviet agent, which is interesting.
It's very likely. I mean, he sabotaged a lot, especially the escape. So at the very last moment, people were allowed to escape from the Soviet army that was advancing really fast. And he already had his valuables stashed away, and he had very, very suspicious contacts, especially the same kind of contacts, aristocratic contacts that you see with Martin Bormann in the north of Germany. And Martin Bormann apparently was the spy Werther who gave away all these secrets to the Soviets. And there's a quote I have here in my notes. It's from Carina Urbach's book, and she says this. She says those aristocratic families that were tied to Russia, mean the old Russia, right? The czars. So these aristocratic families with Russian contacts, they were the earliest to join and support fascism, meaning the German-English houses of Coburg, Hessen, Leiningen, and Hohenlohe. They were all related to what was left of the old Russia, the czars, the Romanovs. And so, and this is an interesting quote, because some of these aristocratic families were not just a spy risk when it comes to Britain, but it was also a spy risk when it came to Russia, because Martin Bormann had these connections, and he ultimately spied for the Russians. So when you're talking about these aristocrats, it's difficult to gauge where the ultimate alliances were, because apparently some aristocrats, like Lord Louis Mountbatten and some others in Britain, some of these aristocrats, they had a relationship with Soviet Russia for whatever reason. They were sort of in bed with the Russians, and so this became sort of a double problem for the Nazis, because all these spies were working for. Well, some of these spies were working for Britain and or Soviet Russia. And also I think in 2009, the London Guardian ran a headline about Mussolini, because historians have figured out that Mussolini had actually in his early days worked with British intelligence when he was officially a journalist, and he was paying people to create chaos and friction. He was getting money from British intelligence at the time. And also the Italian king, he was also somewhat related to the British. And people need to remember, when the Romanov family fled Russia, because this was a large family, most of these people just left Russia. Some of these Romanovs, they went to France. Some of them, they went to Italy, for that matter, because they had relatives everywhere. Some of them went to Denmark, of course. So yeah, this was a nightmarish situation when it comes to intelligence, because everybody apparently knew the secrets of the Nazis, but the Nazis had great problems understanding the secrets of the Soviets. Which we're going to talk about this later, of course. When the Nazis went into the Soviet Union, they did not know how many troops the Soviets had, how many tanks the Soviets had, so they were going in almost blind. That, of course...
And it wasn't only the Germans who were ignorant about them. I think none of the Western services knew much about the Soviet Union. It was after the success of Operation Trust, where so many spies from these countries got arrested and caught because the Russians had fooled everybody in that operation. It was just too embarrassing. It was too difficult. They didn't know how to get a foothold. And the Russian Soviet counterintelligence methods were just so darn advanced, and they had penetrated the Western services during Operation Trust. And I think that it was very difficult for the Western services to recover from that early defeat.
Yeah, I have some notes here. This is from the London Guardian, and the story in 2009. So newfound documents from the archives shed some light on this. The year was 1917, and Mussolini was paid by the British MI5. So this is when Mussolini got into politics. So he had British backing. And Mussolini at the time was 34 years old. So he was influencing Italy during World War I. He was publishing propaganda. Mussolini was also sending out his people that he paid with British money. He was creating some friction to influence, public opinion. And the money for Mussolini was... The money for Mussolini came from Sir Samuel Hoare, a British politician and also MI5 agent in Rome, and he had about 100 British intelligence officers at the time at that place. And so this was becoming sort of a network of crazy proportions. So, for example, Karl Eduard, Herzog von Sachsen, Coburg and Gotha, he actually got Fritz Thyssen to become more involved in the Nazi regime. Fritz Thyssen, of course, the big name in steel production, and the Herzog von Sachsen, Coburg and Gotha was also bringing in the banker Hjalmar Schacht and the industrialist Günther Quandt. The Quandt family is involved in BMW, the car company, or I think they even owned it at the time or created it. So if you've seen a BMW, that's basically the Quandt family right there. And also this Herzog of Sachsen, Coburg and Gotha, he was involved before the Nazis even took power. They were giving people cover identities and giving them a safe place to live, and there were ties to the secret organization called Organisation Konsul, and they were conducting assassinations to make it possible to take over in Germany. So these people were scouting. By the way, these people were scouting different candidates for the role of dictator. So Hitler was just one of several candidates, but they ultimately decided on him.
As you described, the British trying to have appeasement, the Russians had their own way of viewing Hitler, and they wanted him in power. This is Viktor Suvorov's book, Icebreaker, very famous book. I think you got to pay a couple $100 to get a copy of this. It was published in Great Britain. And Viktor Suvorov was a GRU officer who defected, I think, in 1979, if I'm remembering correctly. He wrote a lot of good books, Inside the Aquarium, Inside the Soviet Army. He wrote a lot about Russia's World War III or Soviet World War III plans. But this book is really important because when he was educated originally, he was a tank officer in the Soviet Army. He participated in the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. But he was really a professional military guy, a Soviet military guy who ended up in the GRU. But he was fascinated by operational art of war and World War II, and he was able to see certain maps that he saw when he was younger, when he was in military school, of the deployments before 1941, the German invasion. And this is what got him I showed you his other book, The Chief Culprit. He started to privately collect information for himself. And then afterwards, after his defection, and especially, he was able to correspond with veterans of the Second World War because there were things he wanted to put together. And this first book is quite an interesting research. But then after he wrote this book, his book, The Chief Culprit, it was a massive correspondence. Of course, this book came out in the 80s. Massive correspondence with those who were still alive, who were in the war, that could tell him things. And of course, it was his thesis that not only did Stalin bring Hitler to power and called him the icebreaker, this was Stalin's nickname for Hitler. Hitler was the icebreaker of the world revolution. Yeah. And he talks, of course, about Lenin had the idea that, okay, there was the first imperialist war, which is what they call World War I, but there's going to be a second imperialist war, said Lenin in 1920, and we have to be ready to use that war to expand communism by being on the right side, by manipulating the outbreak of the war, by setting different imperialist powers against each other. And so this was integral to Lenin's strategic thinking in 1920. And it's also, this is actually the first book before Viktor Suvorov, and Suvorov might have gotten some of his ideas for it. There's a German version. This is the English translation. Ernst Toppisch was a German officer in World War II. He was in 6th Army. He was wounded before 6th Army was surrounded, so he got out with his life without being a prisoner. Stalin's War was his book. This was written in the early 80s. And it is an analysis of grand strategy and diplomacy between Russia and Germany. And he was the first one to actually find, amazingly, his research. He was a professor in a different field than military history, but he collected data because he always thought there was something funny about the way this war started. And he was the first one to say, look, Stalin and Lenin designed this World War II. They had this as a design. And they had a similar design for a war in the Pacific. So their design for World War II was to set the powers in Europe, Germany and the West, against each other, and to have Japan and the United States and China against each other in the Pacific. So it was a similar pattern in both theaters. And these are both, by the way, the Soviet Union goes all the way to the Pacific. So this is very much on their doorstep, just like Europe is, because it's 13 time zones and so on. So it's very important to understand this idea. And so you had something, I think, and I know something about when Hitler came to power, how Stalin helped Hitler become chancellor.
Oh, yeah.
Could you comment?
Well, now, for a while, the Nazi Party was in trouble. Now they did gain a lot in various elections, but it was just not enough. They had spent millions and millions, and they got money from all sorts of places. They got money from Sir Henry Deterding, who was one of the main stock owners of the oil company Shell, or Royal Dutch Shell, and this was also of course tied to the royal family of the Netherlands. Some people may recall Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and his family relations to the Nazis. So they got all this money in, but it was never enough. They could not take full power. And the communist movement was also really strong in the earlier 1930s. So you had the Communist Party in Germany, with all their contacts to Moscow, of course, and then you had the Social Democratic Party, and they were also very much pro-Russia, because as we know, the Soviets did not want any communists out there that were independent or just communists that didn't like Moscow. Okay, so you had two parties in Germany that were pro-Moscow. They were very similar in their ideological view, and also you had all this these supporter circles. You had millions and millions of people who were left-wing or even communists. So naturally, some people thought Stalin would give the order to have a united front, a united left front against Hitler and the National Socialists, but instead the order was given for the Communist Party to attack the Social Democrats and call them everything under the sun, and just to not have this resistance against the Nazis. Now, of course, these Social Democrats were horrified, and they talked to their contact people, and some of them were even ordered to appear in Moscow. And so that's when the situation was explained to them. They thought, we could try a communist revolution in Germany, but this communist system then would not last very long, and then this would have been the last chance ever of taking power. So what we're going to do, this was Stalin's idea. What we're going to do is we're going to let the Nazis do their thing for a couple of years. They will fall apart, and by that time, a true communist revolution will be possible, and everything's going to turn out fine. But of course, behind the scenes, Stalin was betting on a big war in Europe. These European powers would kill each other off or weaken each other, and then the Russians could march in. Now, this has been talked about, for example, in you can read about that in Robert C. Tucker's book, Stalin in Power, The Revolution from Above. This was pretty clear at the time, so we know exactly who these Germans were, these German communists, what they were thinking, what they were told, and of course it all turned out in a very, very horrific very horrific faction. And then also, there's so many things that people are not aware of in general. There's secret training for the German Gestapo, the interior secret police. They were trained by some of these Soviets, in the 30s. So there was all this training, there was all this support that was then used against all dissidents, left wing or whatever.
In fact, a friend of mine in Moscow who used to hang out in the archive where they keep the Lenin documents, the archivist told him, he was discussing this history with him, and he said, we completely controlled Weimar Germany. The Soviet, because their agent networks, the communists had infiltrated, like you say, they controlled the Social Democrats, the communists, they'd infiltrated the Nazi Party, they were in the conservative parties. So the communists were there playing in all the political parties in Germany and under Weimar. And so they could make the political outcome they wanted in Germany. Of course, that outcome was Hitler comes to power. And of course, it's ironic that the Kaiser in World War I brought Lenin to power, financed the Bolshevik Revolution, brought Lenin in the sealed train through Scandinavia into Finland Station in Petrograd, and and then it seems like Moscow then returned the Russians returned the favor by putting Hitler in power in Germany, thinking it was going to help them in their strategy. So it's funny how these countries put people in power to help their strategy, but those people don't do exactly what they want them to do.
Yeah, I have some more notes on this here. So this was 1931. The Communist Party of Germany received the order from Moscow not to pursue a terrorist strategy any longer. The plan was that the Nazi Party would smash the conservative middle class, and the Nazis would also smash the the regular social democrats, and then the communists could take over. There was Dmitry Manuilsky. He was a high-ranking official of the Communist International. He called Hitler. The what is the appropriate translation here? He called him an unwitting comrade of the communist world revolution, right? So he called.
Yeah, and Manuelsky also was very famous for talking about how communism could win by a peace offensive, by pretending to be friends with people. He said this in 29 or 30. He said, we're going to have the most tremendous peace offensive ever in history, and everybody's going to believe we're nice and we're wonderful, and then bam.
Yeah, because the Nazis, the Nazis wanted to create the impression they are somewhat for conservatives in Germany, but the Nazis really hated the conservatives in the regular conservatives in Germany, because they thought these conservatives were lame. They were not willing to do something grand and large and have a real revolution, a right-wing revolution. And so this was kind of the goal of the Nazis, to destroy these old circles, but this was also a goal of the communists, and Hitler was doing this job for the communists, basically, wittingly or unwittingly.
I should point out, Hitler's had two faces. Hitler had two faces. So when he would go before businessmen and the middle class, he would talk about Jewish Bolshevism and the threat of communism, because that's what the middle class was worried about. But when he'd go in front of working men's groups, he would talk about Jewish finance capital, right? Yeah. Jewish bankers, and that's of course the West. So he used anti-Semitism as a way to escape being consistent. So he was only consistent in his anti-Semitism, but in actually what he was telling these different groups, he was telling them what they wanted to hear.
Yeah, exactly. So then you had so then in 1932 you had the German communist official Erich Wollenberg. He talked directly to Stalin in Moscow, and Stalin told him that war was inevitable. But Wallenberg kept arguing, and he said that if we have a communist revolution, there won't be a large war. But this is the point where Stalin ended the conversation. He had made up his mind, and Stalin's advisor, Radek, he said in the same year that the Nazis would stay in power for 2 years, and this is as long as the German workers would have to endure a Nazi government. And so the communists, the communists in Germany, they started to the communists they started to help the Nazis, and they were trashing the Social Democrats, which was of course pretty crazy.
And I mean, Hitler basically eliminated all the other political parties.
Yeah, exactly.
The small conservative ones, he let them have, their token, whatever. But basically, the Nazi Party was the ruling party of Germany from the Reichstag fire on. Basically,
the German military officer Karl Mayer, he talked to Ernst Röhm in 1932, and Röhm told him that within the SA, there were a lot of former communists, the former members of the Red Front Warrior organization. I think that's a translation here on the fly. So this is strictly from Röhm himself. He tells this other military officer, about 1/3 of the men in the SA were communists. And how many of them were still communists secretly? Well, we don't know.
Right.
We don't know.
And
so there were communists everywhere.
This is how the Munich policeman Heinrich Müller became. It got into the Gestapo. He probably was one of those communists, working class. He was a lower class from one of the lower classes. He probably had these lower class resentments. And that's how he probably was recruited early on, a lot of these folks. And I should add that in terms of the number of communists, you'll notice, I think you made this point before, it was the Deutsches Arbeiterspartei, right, the German Workers' Party when Hitler joined it, and he changed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party.
Yeah.
So that was... Yeah, I mean, that was a change with the addition of the word socialism in it.
Yeah. The British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Horace Rumbold, he was watching the success of the Nazi Party, during the elections in 1930. So he was seeing how successful this party had become. So he's asking the Prussian government official Robert Weissmann. He's asking him, where do the Nazis get their money? Because they're advertising everywhere. They have all these big rallies, and all this burns up money. Where does the money come from? And the answer was Russia. So this is what Robert Weissmann told Sir Horace Rumbold, that the money came from Russia.
So the Russians were actually financing the Nazi Party.
Correct. The Berlin newspaper Tageblatt, they published an article on September 13th, 1930. The headline was Beziehungen zu Moskau, that means relations with Moscow. And this article also posed the question, where did the money come from? And they quoted some documents, and they also had some witnesses they quoted. One of the witnesses was a former Soviet ambassador from Paris, and they said that you can find in these Moscow archives, you can find records of the records of payments made to the Nazis, Russian payments made to the Nazis. So this article. Oh, by the way,
Suvrov's thesis.
and Hitler was not happy with this article in this Berlin newspaper, and he reacted to this article, and and also Hitler got into a little disagreement with Ernst Graf zu Reventlow. He was an ultra right-wing guy. He was always very pro-Nazi, and he's been around for a long time. His family is very old. Very anti-Semitic guy, Mr. zu Reventlow, and I also suspect that his family was running Bormann, but that's really hard to tell. So Hitler gets into an argument with this Count Reventlow, because the Count had publicly called for an alliance between the Nazis and the communists. This was even a publication by the Count in a left-wing newspaper, in a left-wing paper, the Rote Fahne, the Red Banner. And so this was there was some of these events where even communists were joining. We were just taking part in these ultra right-wing events. And so this is not what Hitler wanted in public that loud at the time, because apparently Hitler did not want people to find out that all this money was coming in from Russia. So when the Count Reventlow was, schmoozing too obviously with the communists, this became sort of a problem. And so Hitler was reacting to this newspaper article, and he was saying, "No, that's not what's happening. He doesn't know of any of this." This was. Then we have Stalin biographer Antonov Ovseyenko. He talked about agents from the Soviet NKVD. This was Soviet intelligence. And these NKVD guys, they were visiting the German Gestapo in 1933, 1943. So this was kind of the baseline training on how to set up this apparatus of surveilling the population, finding the dissidents, torturing dissidents, finding more information. So the Nazis really learned this from the communists. And this is also something that we saw many times over later in the Cold War, when the Soviets would send their people to countries in Africa to train them, to teach them how to set up a surveillance state, how to train their own people and terrorize the whole population.
And it's fascinating. This is an important thing for people to understand, is that I had there's a communist document that's current, in fact, that I'll have to read at some point, that says that there is no communist doctrine or dogma that we follow. We're flexible, and that we will use any local movement, nationalism, religion, whatever. We will use anything to advance our cause. That anything is good. Whatever advances our cause, we will use, which is kind of in a way a shocking admission. So when people say, "Oh, the communists would never use the Nazis to advance themselves," that's crazy. No, they do it to this day. They understand this strategy of using anything and everything, and the more evil or twisted that thing might be, the more they want to give it encouragement and help it advance.
Yeah. So then in 1936, Lord Londonderry from Britain, he visits Nazi Germany, and the Nazis really wanted to impress this man. They really wanted to give him a lot of sensitive information, highly classified information, information about the planned attacks against Poland and Czechoslovakia. Now, of course, Lord Londonderry was relaying this information to the British government, or the British intelligence, and this was sort of a gesture by the Nazis to create this trust, because the British had spread all this conspiracy propaganda about Jews, and And so the Nazis really wanted to impress the British and be open about the plans and all that stuff. And so, but in 1936, the German military wasn't ready yet, or not as ready yet. And in the same year, 1936, David Lloyd George, former Prime Minister of Britain during World War One, he meets with Hitler at the Berghof, and they're both trying to act real nicely. And so this was sort of the game that the British were playing, what the British were playing at the time.
And Lloyd George said a bunch of very nice things about Mr. Hitler back
Oh
when he
yeah,
visited the Berghof.
exactly. And yeah, there was a scandal in 2015. This newspaper, The Sun, it's like a tabloid. It's not doesn't have the highest reputation, but The Sun was publishing still frames, and they were also publishing a video on the website. This was 17 seconds of old film with the 7-year-old later Queen Elizabeth. So she was a child back then, with her sister Margaret, and with the later King Edward VIII and some others. Elizabeth is doing the Nazi salute, and then the others join in, and they all do the Nazi salute. And The Sun was estimating that this film was shot in 1933 or 1934 at the Castle Balmoral in Scotland. So the Duke of Windsor became king for a while, King Edward VIII. Then he resigned because he wanted to marry an American, Wallis Simpson. And in 1941, even the American FBI became suspicious of them because they both had visited Hitler. So even the FBI was considering this to be dangerous or weird, and very suspicious. And also in 2017 we got some files about the Duke and his wife back in the day. They were pressuring or trying to pressure influential Americans, so they would then apply pressure to U.S. President Roosevelt to not get involved in a war in Europe. So this is sort of the weird lobbying that was done at the time. So these British, they were trying to influence the Americans, and Winston Churchill reportedly was very, very angry about that. And the Daily Mail, this is a newspaper in Britain. This is in possession of the Lords Rothermere, and the Rothermere family was also involved in espionage and in the Air Force, by the way. The Daily Mail in 1937 was publishing a letter of Hitler, where he talked about his planned partnership of these countries, Germany and Britain. The Nordic populations and all that stuff. And so this was in the Daily Mail in 1937, just 2 years before the war. So a major newspaper in Britain publishes this stuff from Hitler where he's lobbying the British the British population.
Yeah, and in fact, Hitler was lobbying the British for an alliance right up through the diplomatic negotiations before the invasion of Poland. He wanted the British to commit to an alliance, and he wanted Poland to give up this territory. And of course, it just wasn't happening. He'd already used up all of his political capital by then. And that taking this German territory that connected East Prussia to Germany was going to end up being a larger war. And of course, the Wehrmacht was, with its doctrines, despite the fact that it was really not as strong as people think it was. They didn't have enough artillery for their infantry divisions. Their tanks were not the best tanks in the world. But they had great doctrine and great leaders, great panzer leaders, and their infantry was pretty good. I mean, some of the divisions, by the way, some of the Landwehr divisions were World War I guys, made up entirely of guys that had fought in World War I who were by then guys in their 40s, right?
Yeah.
This is 20 years later, in their early 40s. And these units performed very well. These guys, they could remember everything. They knew what they were doing. And so the war was against Poland was very successful because of that. But what's interesting is that a lot of people thought that they could, just by standing up to Hitler, they could dissuade him from attacking. And this is where the British lobbying of Mussolini helped. Hitler was expecting Mussolini to go in right away with him at the beginning of the war. And Mussolini came up with a demand. You have to give me all this money. You have to give me all this fuel for my fleet. You have to give me. And Hitler was like, I can't give you all this. I don't have this. So Mussolini said, well, tough luck, pal. I'm not on your side. I'm just going to be neutral. And that almost dissuaded Hitler from starting the war, except there were delegations of British and French in Moscow negotiating to make a treaty with Moscow. That would have made Hitler in a box, right? If Moscow had said, all right, we're allied with the Allies, Hitler would have to said, oh, I'm not invading Poland, sorry. That's suicide. But then Stalin kicked those delegations out, the French and the British, and invited Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, to come to Moscow and offered Germany the non-aggression pact.
Yeah. So Churchill was meeting with Ribbentrop in the German embassy in London. And Churchill said that England had no interest in Germany ballooning to up to 3 times the size, and Ribbentrop was responding to that war was inevitable if Britain doesn't play along. So in November of 1937, Hitler tells his generals to get ready for a war. I mean, really get ready for a war. And of course, quite a few generals and others were removed from their posts. So on February the 4th, 1938, 16 generals were removed and retired. 16 generals, and 44 others were placed in a different position. So the war ministry became the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht under General Wilhelm Keitel, and Keitel basically always did what Hitler wanted. This became sort of this trio: Keitel, Lammers, and Bormann. So they managed access to Hitler. They managed the flow of information to Hitler, and they were executing his orders. And so other generals, they thought about killing Hitler at this stage. Trying to communicate with the Brits, but no deal or back-channel deal was reached. So these events
in fact,
continue.
Admiral Canaris was involved in this early attempt to overthrow Hitler. And this was just before Munich. And Hitler was going to go to war against Czechoslovakia. And the German generals thought, this is suicide. The Czech army was 1 million men. It was strong. It had those good tanks. And they had fortifications. They had their own mini Maginot Line type fortified line. And of course, then you had the French and the British that were by treaty obligated to come to Czechoslovakia's aid. This would have been a disaster. And of course, so Canaris got these German generals to agree to overthrow Hitler. But then Canaris, they said at the breakfast table, the headline was Chamberlain flies to Munich. And he became ill, physically ill, Canaris, because it meant they had all the ducks in a row. They were ready to get rid of Hitler. And basically Chamberlain, by coming to Munich, saved Hitler from a coup.
Yeah, and then you had Baron William de Ropp. He was feeding false information to Alfred Rosenberg. he was telling Rosenberg that high-ranking officers in Britain's Air Force had no intention of waging war against the Germans because of Poland. Once Poland is taken, the whole world, has to accept it, and there would be some sanctions against the Germans, maybe a naval blockade, and some additional negotiations. And then Hitler was telling his military official Franz Halder, the French and Brits are just bluffing. So we can't really be sure how much Hitler was actually believing this. Maybe he was 100% sure, maybe he was 80% sure, maybe he was 60% sure, but he was telling this to Franz Halder, according to his information and all his great espionage that wasn't really great. He was sure, or he was assuring Halder that the British and the French were bluffing. They would not actually
Right. Well, he
wage
really
war.
did believe it. Yeah, Hitler did believe that they were bluffing, and he believed it because Ribbentrop, who was the dumbest Nazi, I think they did at Nuremberg. They got the IQ tested the Nazi leaders, and he tested the lowest IQ of the Nazi leaders. Hermann Goering had the highest IQ. He had a genius IQ, but he wasn't too bright, and he's the one that convinced Hitler. And of course, he had been German ambassador to the British Empire, to Great Britain, and then was made foreign minister. And so Hitler had trusted him if you go to the memoirs of Erich von Manstein, the perhaps the greatest German general of the war, in his memoirs, he recounts Hitler had a military conference before the invasion of Poland, in which many of the generals were like, well, we're going to end up, France and Britain are going to declare war on us. This is not good. And Hitler assured them that the Allies were bluffing. He had assured them of that. So, and then there's the famous account, which is related by Hitler's translator, who was in the room. And I forget his name at the moment, but it was when the declaration of war came from Britain and France, the ultimatum after the invasion of Poland. Hitler's in the Reich Chancellery. He's with Goering, he's with Ribbentrop, and he's with his translator, and I forget, also Hess was there, and among others. And basically the news came that the cable from and of course the translator is translating it. I don't know, he's there for some reason. Maybe he just met with somebody. And it's explained to him that he has so many hours to pull out of Poland, and this declaration of war by France and Great Britain becomes effective, and the World War then begins. And the account is that Hitler was stunned by this. And he looked very angrily to Ribbentrop and said, "You told me this wouldn't happen," right?
Yeah. Now of course, there was a bit of luck involved, because in 1946, at the Allied Tribunal in Nuremberg, we got a statement from General Jodl from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and he said, we would have collapsed during the war against Poland if the British and the French had moved against us. So he estimated 110 French and British divisions, and Germany's rear was protected by only 23 divisions. So there was a bit of luck involved in that.
The West Wall. They had a thing called the West Wall. And they were using, of course, the Rhine River as a barrier as well. It's uncertain how successful. The French did launch a small attempt to go into German territory. But this is a very narrow front by modern military standards. You only need a small number of divisions to protect, because remember, unless Holland, this was the great fear, if Holland and Belgium had joined with Britain and France, opening up an attack directly into the Ruhr, the undefended part of the German West, then the Allies would have easily been able to defeat Germany. But because Belgium and Holland and Luxembourg were neutral, and the British and French didn't think of getting them on their side, or I don't know why they didn't. They could have done this, but they didn't.
Yeah.
Um, Not sure why these developments, but there is another thing. The French and Germans had a different plan that we should talk about early in the war for defeating Hitler, and that plan involved invading um, Norway, parts of Sweden, part that's exposed to the North Sea above Denmark, and I believe Denmark. They were planning to take this area because the Swedish iron ore, which came through Narvik in the wintertime, that Swedish iron ore was decisive for Germany. They couldn't
Yeah.
have built the tanks and the things they needed without it. And the Allies realized that if they moved, and of course they had a plan to invade Scandinavia. And I think, if I'm remembering right, it was in early May they were planning to do the invasion. And of course, Hitler preempted this invasion because after he defeated Poland, the next country he went in is he annexed Denmark and he invaded Norway very suddenly, right out from under the British fleet, as a matter of fact, which is a
Yeah.
very peculiar cross-water invasion against the British fleet, and it succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you want to talk about that a bit, but this may be that
Yeah.
the Allies decided to do it this way, and of course, they were just slow on the draw.
Yeah, I mean it was a bit of luck involved here and there too. I mean the clock was ticking even faster after the invasion of Poland because now the Germans desperately needed the source for iron ore, and they also needed a source for oil. So it was clear that things had to move even faster, and Hitler was trying to negotiate again. So Hitler was sending his amateur diplomat. His name was Daleros, and but Daleros returned empty-handed, even though it was offered to give back large parts of Poland. So they were even offering, we just keep the corridor, and we're gonna give back the rest of Poland as long as the British stay passive. But no such deal was actually reached. So this was
No,
also
and
just
it
just
wasn't.
meant
Yeah.
to stall for time, basically, because even if even if a deal had been reached like this would not have meant the end of the whole story.
Well, it was. I think in the British political elite had decided that they wanted regime change in Berlin. They wanted Hitler gone.
Yeah.
They had determined he was not someone they could do business with. And so they didn't want, and of course, at that point, Britain and France were strong. Why would they want to give up to Germany, give Germany anything? They felt that they could still contain the situation, which they were underestimating Hitler. And of course, Hitler was in a very difficult position because the Germans and French had better tanks, heavier tanks for certain, and they had as many divisions and they had as many aircraft, really, as Hitler did. So there was no real reason to think, just on those numbers alone, that the Western Allies would be defeated by Hitler. And yet, that's exactly what happened to them. And of course,
Hmm.
this blitzkrieg in Norway was extraordinary achievement. And
Yeah.
Hitler did personally organize that invasion. Um, he came up with the right general to do it. They met at the Reichschancellery. They had sandwiches lined out. All the officers were handpicked for the invasion, and they would meet and do the planning, and they would have their sandwiches and their whatever else they served. And it was an amazing operation. They sailed right through the British because they didn't make a big invasion fleet. They had one ship here, one ship there. It was all spread out, so that they got through the British because the British didn't see a fleet. They just saw these isolated ships here and there, and of course they had the Brandenburg Regiment grabbing port facilities and airfields to fly people in. And then there was an invasion that came right up Oslo Fjord and battled its way up. And I think what was the cruiser? They lost a cruiser or a pocket battleship going up there into into Oslo Fjord. That was the stronger. But see, the British fleet didn't come that far east to Oslo Fjord. It
Yeah.
never, because of German air control of the air around Denmark, in between Denmark and Norway, they had a corridor of air control. And of course, this is what allowed the invasion. It was the superiority of the Luftwaffe and the massing of the planes. And you know who enabled that? Not only did Germany, you talked about steel in Scandinavia, the oil, they had made a deal with Romania to supply
Yeah.
them the oil. And they had a deal with Stalin, who supplied the Third Reich with oil and grain.
Yeah, and also the was it the ball bearings that came from Sweden? I think it was. There was this large corporation that made these precision ball bearings that were needed for the war. I mean, all kinds of equipment was requiring these ball bearings. So this was an important victory for the Nazis at the time. But as I said, the clock was ticking even faster because the stalling techniques had failed. So the British were starting to land their troops. The French were getting ready, and Hitler kept telling his people that it would only take a bit longer for a new government to form in Britain. So he was spreading the hope or the wishful thinking that government would change in Britain, and the new government would be much more friendly towards the Germans. So now you had a situation that at the beginning looked like a repetition of World War I, meaning you had to fight the French and you had to fight the British, and now of course the expectation was to repeat the old Schlieffen plan, just to go in through the north and fight the British and then flood into France. That was the expectation, but ultimately the officer Erich von Manstein, he came up with this alternative plan to push with his tanks through the Ardennes, and he convinced the commander, the Oberbefehlshaber of this Heeresgruppe, Gerd von Rundstedt. So they wanted to cut off the French, basically push right into the middle of France.
The Schlieffen Plan was, of course, what they did in World War I, where the man on the far right, his sleeve brushes the English Channel as they come down, and they come in behind Paris with this giant sweep, this giant flanking sweep with a heavily weighted right hook. The von Manstein plan was more subtle. It was to move Guderian's panzer group through the Ardennes forest very rapidly, to pop out around the area of Sedan, which is just above where the Maginot Line ends. And we should mention the Maginot Line. The French, along their border with Germany and part of Luxembourg, they had this massive fortified line, which is extremely sophisticated and almost impossible to breach from the front, and that they were defending their country with. So then they could concentrate their army in the Low Countries when the Germans came. And of course, the French and British had something called the Dial Plan, which was to mass their tanks and troops in the north and immediately move into Belgium to counter the Schlieffen movement. Because they thought this Maginot Line had guaranteed the Germans would have to repeat the Schlieffen Plan. But here was this panzer. Nobody had used tanks in mass like this before. Maybe in Poland, you could say, but not where the Allies experienced it. And if he could break through at Sedan, just above the Maginot, where the Maginot Line ended, around Luxembourg, Belgium, in France, if he could cut up, then a sickle cut up to the English Channel, he would trap the advancing British and French armies advancing into Belgium. He would trap them in Belgium and cut them out of supply from their rear. And this was the brilliance of it. Hitler saw the brilliance of this plan too. Von Manstein was only a colonel at the time, but he is considered the greatest military strategist among the German generals.
Yeah, I mean there was skepticism even within the military ranks, but it ultimately succeeded. So then the Nazi troops were advancing further and further, and there was the possibility of completely encircling the British Expeditionary Force. And of course, the officers the officers thought it was a no-brainer to basically take the entire British Expeditionary Force. But then Hitler gave his famous order to slow down the advance, which gave the British the opportunity to escape, the miracle of Dunkirk. And there was even a new movie made about this, I think by Christopher Nolan, who was a very suspicious character. He just won, Nolan, he just won all these awards for his Oppenheimer movie, which was basically communist propaganda. And he made this Dunkirk movie without mentioning these or really showing these orders that came from Hitler. General von Rundstedt, he was shrugging his shoulders. He stopped the tanks, and he was expecting new orders to come in to finally take the British army. But Hitler was stalling and playing for more time, so the British could actually escape. And there are many witnesses that talked about this. For example, one of them saw and heard Hitler yelling into a telephone at the Reichschancellery, yelling into the phone, it's not the plan to destroy the British Empire. We do not want these colonies to fall into somebody else's hands. We want to work with the British. We don't want to destroy the British.
Yeah, Hitler was still, even though the British thought Hitler was a pariah and never wanted to work with him, Hitler still somehow didn't see himself, didn't understand how they saw him. Krista Schroeder, who was in Hitler's command car, she was his lead secretary at the time. Her memoir, she wrote a memoir when she was dying of cancer in the early 80s. She knew an awful lot, and she remembers being in the car in Hitler's command carriage. It was on a train, where Hitler said this exact same thing that you talk about him in the phone. He was explaining how he didn't want to destroy the British Empire. He wanted to let these British troops get away. And there was another military consideration that a lot of historians miss. Panzers could not just drive around all the time and just gas up and keep driving. The tank tracks wear out. The tanks need to be refitted. In that sickle cut, the Panzer divisions needed to be resupplied, and a lot of the tanks needed to be fixed and looked at, and before they went on their next attack. So there was a reason why the German army couldn't immediately move on the British. Because the units that had caught them were Panzer units, they were motorized, and there were these logistical considerations in this. And of course, the other thing was, how would they know that the British civilians could come up with all these light craft and just go across the channel and pick boys up? Nobody really, that had never happened before in a war. And there's a British movie, I think it's called Mrs. Minerva's War. It was a war film. I think it was even made during the war. It was about a British family experiencing the war, and a good part of it was how they pitched in this operation. And the family had a boat. They had a motorboat, and they went and they picked up British soldiers. All these civilian people did this rescue of the soldiers, and they rescued some French too. But the French army largely just got left behind. And then, of course, the second phase of the attack, when these panzers got refitted, the French could not form a strong enough line to stop the Germans, and they just went right into Paris.
Yeah,
they took out the whole thing, and then it was June, whatever, that the offensive began on May 10th, by the way, of 1940, and I think was the surrender done on May 27th, May 26th.
Don't remember
the date.
Yeah, and also, there was also there may have been some secret negotiations going on at the time during this miracle of Dunkirk, because both sides had the the capabilities to use chemical weapons or even biological weapons. I mean, if the British had communicated their willingness to defend the British islands, I mean, this could have given the impression that an invasion of the British islands was just not worth it, because if the landing zone was contaminated with anthrax or poison gas, I mean, Hitler was traumatized by poison gas from World War One. So I mean, this might have just changed the German calculation, because if in theory you could do it, you could achieve an invasion, but the losses would be pretty significant, and you know, there are many reasons probably that went into this continuous seeking for an alliance with the British, and also, of course, the racial ideology. You know, the Nordic peoples that shouldn't destroy each other, and of course the conspiracy propaganda, because according to the Nazi view, Britain was somehow dominated by a few Jewish people, as well as America was supposedly controlled by a few Jewish people. And so there was still this hope that you can get rid of the Jews, have a new government in Britain, and the alliance would stand, and everything would be
Hitler
hunky-dory.
had this. His anti-Semitism did not serve him well in understanding Britain, and the idea that the Jews control the United States or Britain is laughable, especially in those days. It just wasn't true, as you've pointed out before, and this is a huge problem in Hitler's understanding Great Britain and understanding the West, and understanding also how they saw him as a monster from just the Kristallnacht. I mean, the Western countries believed in freedom. Hitler did not. They believed in honest dealing, and Hitler was a murderer. Hitler had people murdered. Hitler was not honorable. And he broke his word. And of course, this, you know, we know that Western politicians aren't perfect, but Hitler was rotten in a way that even they were appalled by him and realized they couldn't trust him or deal with him.
Yeah.
And they couldn't even understand him, because he made these crazy decisions like invading Poland and starting a world war, when they told him, look, we're going to be at war with you. You don't want to do this. They were trying to dissuade him.
Yeah.
And he wasn't dissuaded.
I mean,
which,
the Brits,
of course, goes back to the syphilis thing, maybe, you know.
The British had hundreds of years of experience of running an empire, and, you know, working with other nations, and just carefully deciding when to go to war and how to go to war. So the Brits were experienced, but the Nazis were these people that came from nowhere. I mean, the leadership of the Nazis, they were these nobodies to the British. And it's typical for a new regime. They are so over the top, they overestimate their own understanding of these matters, and so this was a very significant disconnect. Now, in Britain at the time, a lot about Britain is secret. It's always very secret. It's hard to understand
secrets to this day.
Yeah, and it's hard to understand. It's hard to understand who was making the decisions and who was influencing whom. Now, for example, and of course, Hitler used this secrecy from the British because Hitler was constantly lying to his own people. You know, everything's going to turn out fine, but it was really hard to determine who was making the decisions in Britain. Now, for example, Prime Minister Chamberlain was not in the loop about the secret reports from Bletchley Park, where they decrypted these Nazi communications, the Enigma encryption. But Churchill was in the loop. So Churchill was allowed to know this, but not Chamberlain.
Yeah.
Now, Churchill is from a very old family. He's from the he's connected
Duke
to the
of
Marlborough clan. And the Marlboroughs, they even went back as far as, I think, the early 1700s, when they defended the territory of Hanover, the mini kingdom of Hanover, on German soil for these Welfen kings back then. So this is how far they go back.
Churchill that was the Duke of Marlborough was the one who basically stabbed King James II in the back in the Glorious Revolution and caused his overthrow, and became the Duke of Marlborough as a consequence, and was considered one of the greatest soldiers of that age. What's interesting is it was a very unfortunate for Hitler's attempting to make peace with Britain that on May the 10th, the day that the German offensive into France and the Low Countries started, Churchill was made prime minister and Chamberlain was forced out. And they created a coalition government, which also allowed socialists to come to power with Churchill in Great Britain. And it was due largely to the failure in Norway, because as you recall, I had said that the Western strategy of the Western Allies was to stop the iron ore, to get into Narvik especially, and to get into Norway. And the Germans beat them to it. And the Battle of Narvik went against the British. And the whole Norway thing, it was just a decisive. By the time, the invasion of Norway, to give people the timeline, April 10th. It's a month before the invasion of the Low Countries in France, which was May 10th. So you had a whole month of the Germans winning in this Norway campaign in Scandinavia. And so by that time, Churchill is completely discredited as a leader. His leadership is not wanted. And Churchill then becomes prime minister on the 10th. And of course, you have this terrible situation. They did a movie about this too, about Churchill first becoming prime minister and going through the fall of France and the Dunkirk thing, how dark this was, because Britain's army was basically, the whole British army was defeated.
Yeah.
In June of 1940, in May, June 1940. And it was they had to leave all their equipment behind on those beaches, and they did lose a lot of guys. And the Luftwaffe tore the RAF apart, and tore the French Air Force apart. And it was largely not because of battles in the air; it was the integrated flak, the anti-aircraft guns of the German divisions. The Germans had the 88 anti-aircraft guns, and the numbers of Allied planes were just stripped out of the sky. And the Allied air forces were not effective, and the Western ground units didn't have the same kind of anti-air defenses, which made them vulnerable.
So Hitler was spreading the optimism. He was more or less lying to his own people again. He told them it's going to turn out really, really well. Churchill wouldn't last very long. Lloyd George would replace him soon. The Duke of Windsor would return to the throne and all that. France was beaten, so Hitler lied to his own people that the war in and of itself was more or less over now. And so it would take a while to secure his grandiose successes and to build on that. And his successor as a dictator, his successor at some point in the distant future, his successor would then deal with Russia. Now, that, of course, was a lie, and the British knew that was a lie. The British intelligence officer Winterbotham knew from his sources that Hitler wanted to attack Russia in 1941 without attacking Britain before that. I mean, without really taking over Britain before that. But
Hitler did toy with Operation Sea Lion invading Britain. He really did. He wanted to do it at one point.
The Air Force War, yeah.
And he was tricked by Churchill, by the way, because they were winning the Battle of Britain. They were crushing the RAF. And then the British bombed a German city. I forget which one. And Hitler got mad at these British bombing. And so he thought this was against the rules of war, and so he decided to retaliate. Rather than continuing the destruction of the RAF, he sent his planes in to bomb London. And this changed the war. It raised the British morale because it was a monstrous act to bomb London.
And it also galvanized the Americans.
It galvanized Americans who were sympathetic to the British. It made him look like a bully. Of course, what was it, in the big sports plaza in Berlin, he gave the "We're coming" speech, or "I'm coming" speech. I think it was a "We are coming" speech, where he was going to get revenge for the RAF bombing places in Germany. This was a big strategic mistake, and Churchill goaded him into it. Because if the RAF was just fighting with the Luftwaffe without this stupid bombing, the Luftwaffe was picking them apart.
The British SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, had a campaign a covert campaign in America to lobby for America to join the war at some point, of course, and and of course, Hitler was still trying his his own campaign. So, for example, you had the Haushofer clan, the elder Haushofer. He was this geopolitics academic, and he was he had this idea of a deal with Britain, and the younger the younger Haushofer, he was called Albrecht Haushofer. The younger one, he was very close to Rudolf Hess, who was most likely gay, and so Haushofer was traveling a lot to London, and he had a close tie with the Marquis of Clydesdale, and maybe he was romantically involved with the Marquis of Clydesdale. This was almost treason at that point. This Marquis became the Duke of Hamilton, and the Duke of Hamilton, of course, was also playing the Nazis quite a lot. And it was this Hamilton, it was exactly this Hamilton whom Rudolf Hess wanted to travel to in his modified airplane. So Rudolf Hess was one of the highest-ranking people. I mean, he didn't have
number
a
three.
big official,
I think he was number 3 in line of succession.
He was kept out of the public. He was kept out of the public at some point, but he was still very, very close to the Nazi leadership. And Rudolf Hess was always very, very close to Hitler himself. So at some point, Rudolf Hess tells his guys to add some fuel tanks to his airplane, a small airplane, so he could travel to Britain and meet the Duke of Hamilton. But because Rudolf Hess thought he had these powerful friends in Britain, but of course Rudolf Hess was then just arrested and imprisoned for a very, very long time. And it's not even clear if the
supposedly
prisoner
committed suicide in 1987 or 88.
Yeah, and at some point during the incarceration or imprisonment, some people looked at the files, and his medical files were lacking a wound that he had sustained earlier. So there was some speculation.
Yeah, a British doctor in 1971 did X-rays of his chest, and in World War I, he had been shot in the chest, and there was no evidence of that wound. And so this British doctor said, "This is not Rudolf Hess."
Exactly.
So
Hitler was So Hitler was then lobbying his generals about the big war against Russia, Operation Barbarossa, of course.
And we should start with that next week, because we've got more than 3 hours. So
exactly, because this is really the
beginning of the war.
Yeah,
we've covered it pretty well. Yeah,
but this is then the big phase and the big turn of the war once the Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union began, and this is also then when the United States entered the war. And this is also when
we should talk about how this breakup of this wonderful partnership, between Hitler and Stalin happened, why they fell out, why their alliance didn't hold. We should talk about that next time too.
And also this phase of the war then is when the espionage really, really became a problem for the Germans, not just with Martin Bormann, but also with others, because we know from the intercepted communications that there were several high-placed sources, and they all had code names. One of the code names was Werther, that's probably Martin Bormann, and they all sent material to one guy, he sent it to another guy, and he had these radio operators, and they radioed this to the Soviet Union. Very, very high quality material.
They radioed it through the Red Orchestra, the Rote Kapelle.
Yeah, exactly. And so
Yeah.
that was probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, intelligence failures in recorded human history. And
Yeah.
this is when it all came crashing down, because the Nazis, they had already failed in terms of intelligence. I mean, they had the failure was already there even before the war even began, but then it became sort of one of the deciding factors in the war. And this is what annoys me greatly about these regular documentaries and the regular history books, because they make it all about the tanks and Hitler's grandiosity and the guns and all that stuff, but there was so much more stuff involved. But the Russians, I mean, when the war ended, I mean, the Russians probably made sure that certain information was buried forever and nobody was supposed to talk about it, because if somebody had published this stuff after 1945, this could have led to not just a diplomatic incident, but maybe a Soviet invasion of Western Germany, for example. And so this information is incredibly sensitive, but it tells us a lot about how the Russians operate and still operate to this day. You know, you and I, we talked about the Putin interview of Tucker Carlson, when Putin explained some very, very bizarre concepts in terms of that history. I mean, Putin blamed the Poles.
He blamed Poland.
He blamed Poland for World War II, and he has his own interpretation of the Great Patriotic War and the deal, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So if people understand what happened in World War II, there's the secrets of World War II, they can more accurately judge the way Russia is operating.
Because Russia's behavior, not only is Russia's military failures in the beginning of World War III, if this is the beginning, similar to the failures in World War II, and we should mention the Winter War in Finland as well. But the intelligence, the strategy of creating a larger war, of catching the West by surprise, by being better armed than the West, or ready for certain kinds of warfare, it's all very similar. Only now China is the partner of Moscow's partner, rather than Germany.
Isn't this an interesting parallel we talked about in this episode? We talked about the appeasement and sort of the intelligence operations that they were tied into the appeasement, and the lobby campaign, Soviet intelligence lobby campaigns in America to stay out of the war. And now we have the war in Ukraine, and we have this lobbying going on everywhere, telling people to abandon Ukraine and it's all going to turn out fine. And NATO has this magic button to push and everything's going to be peaceful. But if, once Russia in its long-standing alliance with China, once they make the decision for war, there's going to be a war. And so NATO cannot stop this. America cannot stop this. Abandoning Ukraine will not stop this.
No, it won't, because these are what we find out when we read Ernst Toppisch and we read Viktor Suvorov. This World War II plan of Moscow went back 20 years before the war started. That's how far advanced. And so when we understand this is the way the leaders of Russia think about strategy and prepare if you know what you're going to do 20 years from now, you know what you have to do now. Whereas in the West, they're thinking, what do we need to do for next year, not 20 years from now? So there's a lot of advantage that they get, and also disadvantages from playing it that way. But we're very naive in the West. And understanding this history of World War II, it gives you the keys for understanding what's happening now. Because it really is part of the same story with part of the same cultures and groups of people. I mean, all the people that are running Russia today are just the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people that were running it, 80 years ago.
Yeah, and also people need to understand that as we covered it in this episode, Hitler was lying to his own people. Hitler was lying to the population. He was always telling people it's just going to be one more step. And that's it. And then maybe there's one more step, maybe another step. So this happened in stages. And sometimes countries, they will initiate a war, and they calculate that even in the event of not having a decisive victory, they still may get a deal. They still can settle under favorable circumstances. So they conquer that much, and then they give part of it back, but they're still left with gains. And so this is the same logic that we might see from Russia, where they calculate, if we go on like this with no big war, without China involved, if we go on like this, we won't have a real empire in 30 or 50 years. We can't compete with America. So we need to do something now. And even if it's not going to be a totally decisive victory, we're still going to be left with a sizable gain. And that may be just the cynical choice to start a war, because some people still believe wars are either decisively lost or decisively won, but there's so many shades of gray in between.
The advantage that the Chinese and the Russians have today that Hitler didn't have is that Hitler was one guy. His whole movement was kind of centered on one person. And that's always a problem, because what happens if something happens to that one person, like he gets sick? The other thing is that because it is not based on one person, they don't have to get everything done in the short lifetime of one person. Yeah. They can think generations ahead. And I was a little wrong in saying it was the grandfathers. A lot of times it was, but Putin's father fought in World War II.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not that far removed so the leaders that are his age in Russia, many of them, their fathers fought in World War II. So it's not that far removed from them.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Because Putin's 71, his father fought in that war. We have to remember that institutions and cultures don't change that much in one generation, right?
Yeah, and also, Putin was after the war, Vladimir Putin had to grow up in his destroyed home city, his hometown.
Absolutely.
And so this was he was not a conscious adult in the war, but he had to grow up in the aftermath of the war, and that influenced him. And my own father, he was I think he was born in 1943, so he grew up in the aftermath, which was not as financially difficult, or this was not exactly comparable to Putin's childhood, but still on a human scale, in the human dimension, people were ruined, mentally absolutely shredded, and that also made childhood very, very difficult. And so this is something that influenced.
Imagine you are starving. Everything's in ruins. There's no work. Everything is destroyed. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, and there's also the element of revenge. And I told that people many times that in terms of Vladimir Putin, I mean, Putin swore revenge against the Germans and all the Western people, because even when he was a child, he wanted to join the KGB in order to become a true foreign intelligence asset, infiltrate the Germans, and just take them over. Because he watched this, I think it was a television program or a movie series, The Shield and the Sword, which turned these little children on to strive to become an intelligence officer. And I think in the story that Putin liked so much, in that fictional story, the main character actually does infiltrate Germany and become an intelligence hero.
There's 17. I think Putin also was being compared to Stirlitz in 17 Moments in Spring. Isn't that it? I've watched it. It's a popular Soviet TV series from the early 70s, I think, which is really beautifully done. And it's about a high-level intelligence, German SS intelligence official who is a Soviet agent.
Yeah.
And they got Walter Schellenberg and Heinrich Müller are characters in the story, actually. But it's quite, and of course, Stirlitz, if I'm remembering the name of the character right, he's a hero of the young Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This is somebody that Putin wants to become. So Putin learns German. right?
Yeah,
He learns the German
exactly.
language, and he
Exactly.
goes to work as a KGB officer in Germany.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
from Putin's perspective nowadays, he has all these weapons, the NBC weapons, the cyber capabilities, and just the sabotage capabilities, and all this intelligence infiltration of Germany nowadays. So from his perspective, he's just he's chomping at the bits. He just wants this thing to happen, and
Yeah.
he has all these opportunities. And I think many people don't even understand what his opportunities are. What his window of opportunity ultimately is.
Or
So I
how
think,
much this World War II thing just weighs on him is part of who he
yeah,
is.
yeah, it's his identity. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's become his identity, and I mean, people need to remember his brothers died, his parents almost died. I think one of his parents was considered dead, but then was discovered to be still alive or barely alive. So I think the mother, they already carried her away on like a wooden board stretcher because they thought she was dead. And his father almost got killed many times. This was
Yeah.
it's personal. It's really really personal, and that's where this grand mythology comes from of the white Western people as the devil. Going back to Alexander Nevsky, then the Nazis, the Teutonic Knights, then the Nazis, and now the comparison is always NATO is the new Nazis. This was subtly and not so subtly in many documentaries and many propaganda puff pieces, even on German mainstream television. This one guy, this former star journalist Hubert Seipel, who was caught taking Russian money, he was considered a star journalist. He put out this documentary and he was telling people, well, the Nazis did invade, Putin's hometown. And then they show some judo footage of Putin, and then they sort of talk trash about NATO. And in the minds of the audience, these two things are connected because nobody cares about the judo footage. If you combine these other things, then NATO looks just like the Nazis. And of course, that's where the narrative comes from. NATO wanted to get into Ukraine, and NATO then wanted to attack Mother Russia. So it's
Yeah.
almost like this never ending paranoia of and feeling of revenge. And I mean, we will talk a lot about Stalin in the next episode, and Stalin was very very vindictive. I mean, once he would see you as an enemy, he would absolutely destroy you. And this behavior was part of who Stalin was. This never changed. So by appeasing Stalin, you don't change Stalin. And by appeasing
No.
Putin, apparently you don't change Putin as well.
No, you don't. Well, I want to thank everybody for being with us. We might have to do 3 parts for World War II. But this has been great discussion of World War II and how it relates to what we're going through today. And I'm Jeff Nyquist. I'm in the United States, jrnyquist.blog, and my books are on Amazon, The Fool and His Enemy. And with me has been Alex Benesch. He's got books on Amazon. I think you have some new books out in English now.
Exactly, yeah.
And so go visit our sites on Amazon and get the books, and we'll see you in our next episode.